Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Hey everyone, and welcome to All Together, the Family Science Insights podcast, produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element, with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Dina Sargeant. Let's get started.
Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode. Now, within families, storytelling is the best way to end a night, especially when the kids are in bed and parents starting off with Once Upon a Time. There are also those kind of stories that children aren't read but are told, especially when it includes members of the family and a lot of metaphors that go into it. As the kids get older, it starts to make a little bit more sense. How do these stories really impact our lives as we get older and build on the relationships that we have with our family? Now, joining me today is Constance Scharff, Ph.D. With her focus on transformative studies, her role is as an addiction and trauma researcher. One book that really did stand out to me is called Rock to Recovery, which definitely looks into the impact songwriting has on mental health. Thank you so much for joining me, Constance.
Thank you for having me.
Now, songwriting and storytelling really go hand in hand if you think about it when it comes to the metaphors that sort of come into storytelling with the metaphors that come into songwriting. Could you tell me a little bit more about the form of research and how both storytelling and songwriting really added to the focus?
So I look at complementary and indigenous activities, therapies that can improve mental health outcomes, both within traditional treatment settings and outside of those settings. And what we learned is that, especially in addiction and trauma treatment, the sum of the parts of the activities is not congruent. So if you do storytelling in treatment or you do songwriting in treatment, you have very little impact. But if you do a host of these activities together, they work together and are synergistic. So songwriting and storytelling are the same thing. A song's a poem put to music. Mm-hmm. When we put our stories to song, it has a greater impact neurologically. So that's where they fuse together. But stories are really the foundation of all cultures. Tell me a culture that doesn't have storytelling, and storytelling both for children, right? Aesop's fables that give a moralistic, this is, if you do this, then that thing happens, whether good or bad. Fairy tales have the same thing. If you do these things, then, watch out. I think of The Boy Who Cried Wolf, right? So we can have that, but it's also what binds us together, both as families and as communities and cultures, because they tell us what the rules are, what's in bounds and out of bounds in our lives.
Okay. No, that is a perfect way to introduce the topic, and there's so much to unpack there. Before we get deeper into it, I'd love to get to know some of your interests and recommendations by playing a little icebreaker to help us get really warmed up.
Sure.
So to start off with, do you have a favorite book that you could share with us?
So my favorite book is The Little Prince. And I also love The Alchemist. I like those books because they are the hero's tales, right? They're these mythic fairy tale-like, they're not fairy tales, but fairy tale-like journeys that, I can put myself in the hero's shoes and all the things that they go through. So those are my favorites.
Yeah, no, okay, I can definitely see that. I love The Little Prince. The minute you said that, I was like, finally someone has mentioned it.
Oh, yes. A boa constrictor.
Yes.
So
when it comes to movies, do you have a favorite movie that you could share with us?
So I'm Gen X, so it has to be The Breakfast Club.
We are going to get along just fine. Let me tell you that.
Yeah,
No,
I love The Breakfast Club.
Hands down the best movie and the best sort of storyline ever. No movie can compete with it.
Well, it's a beautiful storyline because you've got wonderfully well-developed characters. Because it's a character study. Nothing happens. They go to detention. They sit there for hours and hours, and then they go home, right? Yeah. And there's some, interactions in between. But it is a character study. So how do you develop a story without any real plot to it? But they do, and they do it beautifully.
Yes. No, they did it amazing. If you haven't seen The Breakfast Club by now, let me read you that. No, it's actually amazing. If you haven't seen The Breakfast Club by now, then you definitely are missing out on something incredible. And I don't think we can get along. Let me put it like that.
It's a beautiful movie.
So how about podcast? Do you have a podcast that you've recently started listening to?
I am on podcasts quite a lot. Mm-hmm. And so I am not dedicated to anyone. Because I listen to the podcast, before I go on them to learn more about them. So I don't, that's not, I really, honestly, I'm audiobooks because I live out in the country.
Okay.
And so, and I'm a writer. So you need to listen to books, read books if you're going to write books. And so I do, I am more audiobooks than podcasts.
Oh, I can completely understand that. Is there a certain audiobook that you like then?
I love novels. Mm-hmm. I love ethnic fiction. Okay. I want to hear stories that are not necessarily mine. I love, I'm Jewish. I love Jewish fiction, but there's a little too much Holocaust stories. There's some that aren't, but there's a little too much of that for me, for my taste. Mm-hmm. But I love to hear, various, whether it's Indian or Thai or Sri Lankan, so it's Asian fiction. I love to hear African stories. I want to hear from authors and protagonists that did not live my life. Yeah. Because I think there's so much beauty in that cross-cultural communication. And I can't write those stories because I don't have that lived experience, right? You write what you know. True. Yeah. And I've gotten to live a lot of places. I've lived in India. I've lived in Kenya. I've lived in the UK. I've lived a lot of places, but those are not my stories, and I can't authentically write them. So I love those.
Okay, well that's a really interesting genre to sort of listen to. I think it's a very particular taste. I will say that.
Yeah. It's not. I'm not into romance or historical fiction or anything like that. I will look at it. I mean, I will listen to it and read it because I want to be well read. But no, I love stories from people from different parts of the world. Really love it.
That's amazing. Now, thank you so much for answering those quick questions, and I hope you're all warmed up for the even harder questions that we're going to be asking today.
Yes.
Now, I know that everyone has a very different definition as to how they see family and what sort of makes a family. So either professionally or personally, do you have a definition of family that you could share with us?
Well, I like the, pretty classic definition. They're people that are related by birth and blood, right? You have a mother who gives birth to children, may or may not, is in some sort of a relationship, whether that's through marriage or some other way with father. And children are born. We have aunties, we have cousins, we have all sorts of familial relationships. And I think there's value to that. Of course, in the modern world, in contemporary times, that gets really mixed up by culture and where you are. So, for example, in the U.S. and Western Europe and Australia, we have the nuclear family, and we have for some time, where it's, mother, father, children in one household, parents, aunties, cousins, we don't live together. Yeah. Whereas in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, you have these wonderfully rich, and in indigenous communities as well, you have wonderfully rich and multi-generational, very often families living together. We also have, very often work in South Africa, and, back in the late 80s through the 90s, but back in the late 90s, you had a whole generation basically gone. Mm-hmm. So family was very often grandmother with very young children, because AIDS took out really a whole generation of people. So family can look very drastically different ways. We have places in the world where there are, one man has multiple wives. We have, other places that are matriarchies, places that are patriarchal. There are all sorts of different makeups. We also have family of choice, right? Which is very big, in the United States, especially with the LGBT plus community, that if you are not accepted, doesn't always look this way, but if you are not accepted in your family, then you create that family. You see that a lot with homeless youth, create their own families. You see it actually in jail, more so in women's prisons than in men's, but you see people creating family. I also, people get adopted into families. I was just in New Zealand a few months ago in January, and a Maori family basically adopted me in. Now, one of the things that I love about that culture is an older woman is always auntie, an older man is always uncle, Yeah. So there's this cultural respect just by virtue of age. But then in this one family that I'm really adopted into, I am the auntie, even though I am not related to them.
Yeah.
So family has a multitude of meanings depending on where you are and what you need.
Yep. No, that's very true. And I definitely agree with you when it comes to New Zealand. I grew up there for a little bit of a time. And the community, everyone's suddenly auntie. Everyone's auntie, uncle. There's that respect that's sort of just ingrained in you that you can't get out of. Like you can't, the minute you say their name, that's it. You're disowned. There's no confusion about it. Like you have to be that respectful, and it's just a really well-known thing.
Well, it's all through the Pacific, and it comes with responsibility. Mm-hmm. It comes with responsibility because I'm not going to let your kids get away with misbehaving.
Yep.
And you're not going to, I don't have children, but you're not going to let my children get away with misbehaving because I am the auntie.
Yep.
I do have that role even without the blood relationship.
Yep.
Whereas in East Africa, for example, and Southern Africa as well, I would be mom, right? Mm-hmm. Mama, instead of auntie, but I still have that older maternal responsibility. Yes. With or without blood relationship.
Very true. No, it's a very interesting way as to how you sort of go to a different country and really recognize it. Especially speaking about like family relationships and going into the different positions that each family holds. When it comes to storytelling as well, how does storytelling really shape how a family is sort of relating to each other and gaining the story time and storytelling and different, especially when it comes to places like New Zealand where the stories are very, very based on fictional characters, but suddenly you don't realize that it's very much a metaphor for a person who is going through a situation.
Well, I have to say, are they fictional characters? I don't know. Yeah. I don't know. It's what you believe them to be, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, some people would say Jesus is a fictional character. I don't know. It's how you relate to them. Yeah. So I don't think there's anything really more important, or not important, foundational to families than storytelling, because all families have stories, know, and it might be that women are in the kitchen making a holiday meal and the recipe, card comes out and they say, oh, this was your great grandmother's recipe for whatever, and meatloaf, I don't know. And she's from this place and she married this person and they came, in my case, to the United States in this year. And this is why they came here. Were they fleeing persecution? Were they looking for, better economic situations? Did they have a family member here already who was ailing and maybe needed their help? right? And so we get this richness of a connection to ancestor through stories. What's important, and the reason I say, are these people real or not, is because what comes to us may or may not be true.
Yep.
But we relate to it as if it is verifiable history.
Yeah.
But I found out in my own family, a lot of the stories that on my mother's side of the family in particular are not true at all.
Yep. I can imagine that. That happens a lot in my family as well. And especially, it always sounds like the storytelling, it always almost sounds like gossiping. If it's about like another family member as well, it's like a different form of gossip, because storytelling of a family member that happened, like the line that it has between the storytelling and the gossiping is very, very thin. Especially, I don't know how it is in your family, but in my family, that's definitely how it really is perceived sometimes.
Well, there's something in Hebrew called lashon hara, the bad tongue or the evil tongue.
Yeah.
And that's gossip. So is the point of the story to poke at or wheedle at the person's reputation, place in the family or whatnot? Or is it meant maybe as a cautionary tale, right? You know, auntie did this and ended up in prison, so maybe you should not follow in auntie's footsteps. Yeah. Or maybe auntie did this, stood up and was part of a revolution and was unjustly imprisoned. And that's why they came, you know, to this country or that, wherever they came to. My dog groomer was a political prisoner in the former Soviet Union. Right. And so maybe that tale about, you know, auntie did this and was imprisoned, maybe that's, you know, yeah, auntie's a great person. Like, look at how brave auntie is. So it depends on the point of the story. What is it that we are trying to do? Because stories in families really are control mechanisms. Right? We want you to do these things. We don't want you to exhibit these behaviors. And so we create stories that reinforce that. We also use stories to keep secrets or not to look at things that were difficult.
Yeah.
And so all of that has to be taken into account. So my family doesn't really use stories as gossip. If we're going to gossip, it's going to be one-on-one and straight up, right? Yeah. Like my mom's going to be like, oh, did you hear what happened to blah, blah, blah? And I'd be like, oh, you know. But those kinds of stories, I tend to, this is just me, I tend to shut them down because I don't want to hear things that degrade another person if I'm with my family. I'm with my family so infrequently. I want to hear the stories that tell what a great family we are. And those are the ones that I ask to be repeated and that I repeat back when we're at family functions or family gatherings. And they're the ones that I share with, you know, the people around me.
Now, speaking of different perspectives when telling stories, if some stories between families are told differently than what others may remember, what could that mean for a relationship in the family?
That is a really good question. So the truth is, nobody remembers the story the same way. Yeah. And I have a wonderful example of this. My mother and her younger brother, she has 3 brothers, one older, 2 younger, but her next younger brother, they share the same birthday. So they are exactly 2 years apart. Yeah. And they were very close growing up, like just, you know, good friends and confidants and so on and so forth, and continue to be. Well, there's a story all through my growing up that my mother has told me. And I don't know, she was maybe 8 or 10. So her brother was 6 or 8. And she got angry with him. And she says she stabbed him in the shoulder with a scissors.
Okay.
And I was like, wow, okay, well, that's a little violent. And the story's always been the same. I stabbed my brother. He was irritating me and I stabbed him with the scissors. And I'm like, okay, thanks for sharing that, Mom. I said something to my uncle. I said, oh yeah, remember the story about the scissors? Now, this is recently in the last 6 months. And my uncle looked at me and he was like, I stabbed her with the scissors. They absolutely remember it differently. And that is their reality. In his reality, he stabbed my mother. And in her reality, it's a victimless crime because neither one of them was ever a victim. They both stabbed the other one.
Yep.
But that's what story does. There's no way of telling. Their mother's gone 25 years at this point. So there's no way of going back and saying, hey, Bubby, who stabbed who, right? Yeah. I have no... But each one of them has their own truth. And their truth is, I stabbed the other one. So what does this tell us? It tells us that stories are relative. Mm-hmm. That's why when you said earlier, is it Maoris or Pacifica groups have these stories based around fictional characters? Well, are they fictional? Not to the storyteller. If you're, Scandinavian and you believe that Odin is a genuine character and you act as if that is true, mm-hmm. in some ways that is your truth. That's the power of story. Yeah. So what does it do to the relationships? Well, in some cases, my mom and uncle just thought this was hysterical because they both think the other one is wrong. But who cares? It happened 70 years ago, right? So nobody really cares that much about it. On the other hand, these can be very disconcerting. So if you have one child who's like, no, I was very much abused by parents or uncle or whoever, and you have another child in the same household who says, that is not what I saw, that is not what I experienced, that is not what I remember, mm-hmm. or a parent. So you have a parent who abuses a child and the child says, you abused me. If a parent retells that story, or any abuser, doesn't have to be a parent, but in this case, let's use that example, retells themselves a story that, no, I didn't do that. They can come to believe that, and that becomes their truth, even if it's factually incorrect. So you could put that person on a lie detector, and they're going to pass. They'll be like, I didn't hurt you. I don't know where this is coming from. Because it makes them feel too bad to believe it themselves. So then that person, the child, potentially now adult in this case, is like, oh, hey, wait a minute. You are completely invalidating me. But they're also telling everybody's telling their truth. Yeah. It becomes very complicated.
Yeah, no, it really does. So when that happens, how do you sort of come to say, okay, let bygones be bygones. If you're right, if you believe that you're right, you believe that you're right. If I believe that I'm right, I believe that I'm right. How do you sort of come to some agreement through that?
So I think the thing for the person who feels wronged.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And believes that. And that's they're going to have to get that validation elsewhere. If they need validation or support of that, they're going to have to get that elsewhere. And you get to decide as an adult, mm-hmm. first of all, is this person continuing to harm me? Because if they're continuing to harm you, then that's a deal breaker, just straight up, right? Yeah. But if they're not, then you get to decide, does this relationship have value to me? Mm-hmm. And if it does it have value on these terms where they are now? Because it's unfair in any relationship for us to keep bringing something up over and over and over, expecting another person to have the response we want them to have.
Yeah, that's very true. That's
right?
Very true. Yeah.
So for example, I was actually no contact with my mother for almost just about 10 years. And I ended up breaking that agreement with myself because my uncle, the one that she's very close with, had a stroke, mm-hmm. and I'm his medical power of attorney. And I didn't feel it was right of me not to call her and give her updates on how my uncle was doing when mm-hmm. I know that they are very close. Mm-hmm. And so I started calling her and I said, I'm going to call you and I'm going to give you updates about my uncle until, he is able to do that. But I was dealing with all the physicians and whatnot. And then in that conversation, she had changed. And she no longer was doing the things that caused me to be no contact with her. Mm-hmm. And I came to a decision, that was 2.5 years ago. I came to a decision of, you don't do the things that I asked you not to do. The things that I said, this is the deal breaker, no more interaction. She's like, I don't know what's different about me. And I was like, well, I can tell you, you treat me very differently. And there is value to me in having the relationship. Mm-hmm. And so long as you continue doing what you're doing and behaving the way you're behaving, I am 100% happy to be in relationship with you. Mm-hmm. I probably talk to her, I don't know, 4 or 5 hours a week.
Oh, wow. No, that's pretty... That's
all the
really
time.
Big change, yeah.
It's huge. It's huge. But I see value. Now, am I going to bring up that, 50 years ago she was unkind to me? Well, no. Because what does that do? Yeah. What matters to me is that she is delightful. Like, she's not only acceptable, she's delightful to be around and considerate. And I want that for however long I get to have her in my life, because she's not a young woman.
Yeah. No, that's very true. And I think especially when you're holding on to the stories as well, like especially when we're talking about stories and how it comes in within a family, I do want to know, how do stories that we tell within the families, how do they shape our sense of identity and belonging within the family? Say, for example, if the child is adopted and you tell the story of the adoption, and that's a story that the whole family...
Gotcha day. That's
hear.
Yeah, gotcha day. Yeah.
So how does that really add to the sense of belonging within the family?
I think any stories that we tell in a family system are foundational. They are the basis of learning who we are. Mm-hmm. So if you hear your skin color is off, you're too light, you're too dark, you're too whatever, that you are unacceptable, that you are the wrong gender, right? We wanted a boy, you're a girl.
Yeah.
That people of your whatever can't, religion or gender, whatever the case may be, cannot do certain things. Mm-hmm. All of that shapes who we are. If no one tells you that you're adopted, right? And then you find that out later, versus is going to have one set of impacts on you versus someone who's like, no, we have a gotcha day and we're so grateful that you're, part of our family. I have godchildren that have 2 moms, right? From, well, obviously they did not do that the, old-fashioned way, if we can say it politely, right? Yeah. That was all IVF. And so it's not like the kids don't know, right?
Very true. That is very true.
But what they do know is that their parents, the family story, which I think is true, is that their mothers wanted them so much that they went through this very complicated, very expensive process. It destroyed the body of the mother who gave birth to them. I mean, her health is never going to be what it was before. Mm-hmm. And, every time, someone says, well, this is probably a result of this medical problem is probably a result of the IVF. She's like, but it was worth every minute of it. I love these kids. Yeah. So it's what you're told. So I was brought up in a family where I said, I want to be a doctor. Okay. I knew I'd be some sort of, PhD, not a medical doctor, a Ph.D. Mm-hmm. I thought I'd be an archaeologist. I'm really closer to an anthropologist or a human geographer. I'm in a transdisciplinary field, but I'm really more into that. So right next door to archaeology is it's really hot, most of these places that you're digging around in. So that was really not for me. Yeah. And I wanted to be a writer. It never occurred to me that was foolish, or you're not going to make a living at that, or that's not what, you got to go get a job and you got to be a like a medical doctor, whatever. Like, they were like, oh, I was like, I don't think I want to get married and have kids. And then my family was like, okay.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
There was no pressure for that. It was like, oh, you want to go out and be a writer? Oh, do you like school? I love school. Well, then your Ph.D. is good for you because it's a lot of school. Mm-hmm. And then you might work at a school. I don't at this point, but you might. Like, it just, my family had a narrative. They didn't say girls can't do certain things. They said, well, okay, that's what you want? Well, how do we make that happen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We have a wonderful story in my family about when I was born and how I got my name. And when I was born, my mom and dad had a deal. If I was a girl, my father was going to name me. And if I was a boy, my mother was going to name me. That was the only gender story that I've ever heard. And my father, I was named after both his sister and his grandmother. And my brother has the name that my mother picked out.
Oh, wow. No, that's it's such a great story as well, especially talking about families and relationships that sort of has a narrative that isn't very gendered specific. It's not very focused on, okay, because you're a girl, you can't do this or you have to do this. And it changed the narrative for how your sense of belonging and sense of self really came across.
Well, and this is why I say this is foundational. Storytelling is foundational for who we are. Yes. Because we can't see the world outside of the stories that we tell ourselves. See, our brains work in a very particular way. Our brains there's so much happening in the world around us, and it cherry picks details and creates stories around those details. So I work in addiction treatment. One of the things we work with is spiritual experience. One of the ways that people overcome addiction is having this, sort of God moment of, well, wait a minute, this can be different, or I need to be on a different path, or some sort of spiritual intervention. And what's interesting about spiritual experiences when you study them in a more academic way is that spiritual experiences always happen within the framework of the stories you know. Mm-hmm. So a Jewish person doesn't have a Hindu spiritual experience. They wouldn't know to have Shiva or Krishna or Kali or whomever have some sort of interaction with them. Or a Christian who's walking along some sort of pilgrim trail, like the one that's in Spain, right? I don't even know what it's called, right? But it doesn't mean anything to me. It's a trail.
Very true.
When people have stigmata, right? Buddhists don't have stigmata. Catholics have stigmata because it's what we have the experience that is framed in our stories.
Yeah. No, it makes a lot of sense as well. I think there's a whole lot of idea of, okay, everyone has their own, when they say everyone has their own experiences, everyone really has their own experiences. It's very tailor-made to a lot of the stories that we do see ourselves or we have sort of heard from within our family. And I think everyone really says is that everything starts at the house. Everyone starts in the family. Everything that we learn starts in the family. Now, I think this slides us really well into the practice and habit part of the show and dealing with the practice that I think is going to be very incorporated really well with what we're just talking about. So what are some of your recommended strategies to really incorporate storytelling into family interactions for families who don't really have a lot of stories to share?
Well, I think families do have stories, and if they don't have stories, they make them up.
Yeah.
And you see them, even if don't have stories, right? Let's use that supposition, which I don't think is true, but then we make them up. You see it in sports figures, celebrity sports figures who have a single mother. And the story usually, not always, but usually is, my single mother worked so hard for me to have the opportunities that I have. Yeah. So even if we don't know who father is, or we don't know where, we come from. I have a friend who is Native, but her mother was adopted out of the tribe and was brought up in a, family of European descent. And mother isn't interested in finding the tribal connections, but her daughter is.
Yeah.
And so there are competing stories, and out of respect, daughter said, I won't do anything until my mother passes.
Yeah. No, that's really good.
And you get a lot of that. So all families have these stories. What I would say is the caution is to be aware when stories are denigrating, when stories are damaging. Your good for nothing father ended up in prison. Look at the way he's spending money on that floozy over there instead of sending child support. Those are stories too. So what we really have to be conscious of is, are we telling stories that are like my family saying, oh, you can do whatever you want. You want to be a prima ballerina? Well, then we should get you ballet classes, right? That's not what I asked for, but and if we have been brought up hearing these negative stories, then what do we do to sort of deprogram ourselves and tell ourselves different stories? And do we need to? So I was last summer I went to Bucharest, to Romania, because my mother's family is from Romania. And part of the family's from Romania, parts from Ukraine, parts from Romania. And the Romanians and the Ukrainians, they didn't get along very well, which I always thought was odd because they basically live on like the tiniest plot of land, and the border just moved back and forth across them. I was like, you were just Jews living in Eastern Europe, and the border moved. I was like, I don't know why you hate each other so much, but they did. And my mother's maternal side of the family, the Romanians, they had these stories about Romania, the motherland. It's so beautiful. Why did we ever leave? And I was like, wait a minute. Something's fishy here, because I'm hearing these stories about beautiful Romania. And Romania, by the way, is beautiful and fantastic. I'm not denigrating Romania. It's just my family's experience. I was like, wait, I said this to my mom, didn't your grandmother come over to live with her uncle, who was not her uncle? He was just some guy from the village who was willing to take a kid. They were doing a kinder transport because there was a pogrom. This woman came over. She's a girl. She came over at like 12 or 13 years old and never heard from her family again because the whole village was shot.
Oh, wow.
And whenever the younger family who was saying Romania is so fantastic would say that to her, she never said a word and just cried. I'm like, so Mom, if this is her reaction to how beautiful Romania is, why do we need this family story? That's clearly not true. But it played a purpose of uniting the family. And they could create this fictional Romania because they were dealing with problems here in the United States and anti-Semitism, and there was World War II, and they were scared. And, they lived at that point in Los Angeles. And my other grandmother told me how terrified they were. They were Germans. They were Bavarians. Prussians, actually. But they, who came over in the 1850s. Like long before World War II. But they were terrified when they watched the Japanese put into internment camps.
Yeah.
They thought they were next. So they had this story of, we're not German. I don't know what you're talking about. We all speak English. We've been here for generations, So these stories serve a function.
Yeah.
We just have to make sure that the stories aren't harming someone in the telling. And it's usually the younger people, not like the story I told about my great-grandmother. It's not usually the older generation that's harmed. It's usually the younger generation of, you can't do that because there's going to be some bad consequence. Like, you can't be gay because it reflects on me. Really? How? I don't,
Yeah. There's one book that you mentioned that you wrote as well, your most recent book that you've written, and that is called The Path to God's Promise.
Yes.
Now, for our open mic, I love for you, maybe in the last minute or so, to maybe shed some light as to why we think that that's such a great storytelling book and how that sort of evolves with that.
So normally I write nonfiction. And I wanted to write a book about climate change, really trauma related to climate change. That's really the last 10 years where my research has been moving, is how do we deal with mental health in far-flung communities that are really starting to feel literal trauma from climate change. And as I was starting to research a nonfiction book, I found huge pushback, climate deniers and anti-intellectualism, and that's not real and that's not fair. And I thought, well, then why don't I tell a story? And so it's a fictional book, and they tell the story of Eleanor Simintov, because remember, I like ethnic fiction, right?
Yeah.
So I write what I know. I write about a Jewish lady, Eleanor Simintov, who's a woman of no particular renown. She's not special in any way, except that she hears from God. And God says, I want you to be a prophet and talk about climate change. So in this storytelling now, I get to talk about climate change, right? And I get to dive into what the idea of spiritual experience, because in Jewish tradition, there are no more prophets. Hasn't gone well the last few thousand years when people claim to be prophets. And so that isn't allowed in Judaism anymore. But what would happen? Did God get that memo? I don't know. Maybe there are prophets. I have no idea. So I got to look at, by diving into story, I got to look at, what does it mean to have a spiritual connection? What are we willing to do when we have a calling? It doesn't have to be literally from the mouth of God, but some of us feel like we need to do. I felt like I needed to be a writer. Maybe you feel that to do a podcast, like how to interview people, to, whatever it is, to be a chef, to ride horses, whatever it is that we feel called to do. What are we willing to give up? How far are we willing to pursue that? So these are the ideas that I got to look at in the book, because I don't think there's anything more important than story. I belong to a group called the Society for Consciousness Studies. And we look at, in our research, the nature of being, the nature of the universe, the nature of consciousness. And we're coming more and more to believe that this notion that this is all an illusion. And I love the Hindu concept that this is a dream. This is all just a dream, which means the stories we tell ourselves are of the utmost importance. Because whether it's true or not, truth with a little t, if you believe it's true, it's true. If you tell me at the Addiction Treatment Center you can't get better, you're going to die, and there's nothing I can do to help you, that's the story I have to change. The rest of the treatment doesn't matter. If you believe there's nothing that we can do to help you, then there's nothing I can do to help you. They're truly. I mean, we've seen this before with people who have a medical condition and they believe they're going to die.
No,
and they die.
True.
They die. So not that you can just wish yourself into some, magic place. There's lots of people who believe that they're going to get better and pass anyway, right? But we have so much power in our minds.
No, that's
and
very true.
That creates our reality. And so that's why I wrote The Path to God's Promise, is I wanted to look at what can we really do if we believe that we can.
No, that's such a great way of looking at it as well, because it's built in all your different parts of research that you enjoy looking into and has such a great story onto it as well. So if any of the audience who's watching wants to know a little bit more about the book, is it available on Amazon and other places as well?
Yeah, it's available on Amazon. It's available by order. You know, if you want to go to a brick and mortar bookstore, anywhere books are sold. Yeah.
Perfect. No, that's amazing. I'm definitely going to start Googling into it and try to find a little bit more about it. And I'll definitely try to find the link and attach it down below for anyone who wants to access it. Now, thank you so much, Constance, for coming on and sharing about storytelling. And if any of our audience wants to know a little more about your work or find out a little bit more about you or get in contact with you even, is there a place that I can send them to?
Yeah, so I have a website. It's constancescharff.com. All my books, my research institute, my background, all of that is available on there. And on socials, it's at Dr. Scharff, Dr. Scharff, except on Twitter, it's at DOC Scharff.
So yeah, definitely go and check out some of Constance's work and have a look at some of the books as well. I think the Story to the Songwriting book was really one that stood out to me. So I'm going to go and look into that.
Yep. So that's called Rock to Recovery.
Perfect. There you go.
It's great. It's 18 stories. I love stories. All my books have stories. They're either our stories, they're poetry, they have case studies, but it's 18 stories of people who have used music to help overcome addiction and trauma.
That's perfect. I think we sort of underestimate music. So I'm definitely going to look at that up and have that down below if anyone wants to access that as well. I mean, like you said, it's all on the website, so definitely go and check it out. Thank you so much again, Constance, for joining me on the show today. It was amazing having you on.
Thank you for having me.
And I have to say that I love your energy, and I hope you guys all did too and learned so much more about storytelling and its importance in a family. I'll see you all in the next episode.
You've been listening to All Together, the Family Science Insights podcast, produced by the Family Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it so that we can grow and bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at fa.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Dina Sargeant. Thanks for tuning in.